I'm so excited for this. This has been in the works for a while. For those of you who were on the first one, you know that one of the missions that we have here at Better Impact is to help volunteer coordinators and professionals all across the globe uh, get more resources and more respect from their organization, where volunteerism is seen in every part of the community as that strategic multiplier that we all know that it is. And so, one of the topics that we're really focused on is how to come alongside and help people advocate for incremental investments in their volunteer program. And so, after reviewing the first webinar and giving some great tools, we thought, what could be better than inviting someone like Beth Steinhorn, who has so much experience and has been a consultant in the space and in the space for so long and has so many stories, just to have a conversation. And so we hope this goes not like a Q&A, but more conversational. Feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers as well. Just want to start the conversation out with you, Beth, to say, first of all, thank you so much for coming. And we've had some introductory calls, but tell me a little bit from your perspective why you think it's important to have this conversation around this idea of incremental investment in volunteer strategies.
Well, first, thank you as well for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Very honored and happy to be part of this and to talk about something I'm pretty passionate about. So thank you for everyone as well for joining us. When I think about why have I been talking about investing in volunteer engagement for about 2 decades now, and why is it especially important in this moment? Four things come to mind. First of all, we look at systemic issues. We know we've known this for years, but in recent research, and we'll share some of these links in the chat. If not immediately, I'll do it when I'm done speaking. But we know from recent research, as as recent as just first quarter of 2026, released by Points of Light in their national strategy progress report, that we know from volunteers and from nonprofit leaders that there is a persistent friction between how people access and navigate, how they access volunteer opportunities and how they can navigate through them. That basically there's a disconnect between, because of fragmented systems and challenges in finding how to volunteer, inconsistent communication, that it's difficult for people to get involved even when they want to. And on the organizational side, they're seeing the effects of that and are also challenged. So number one is there's a disconnect in our systems. Second, not unrelated, is funding issues. And we know from research in 2022 through the Do Good Institute, again, I'll share some of these links, in the State of Volunteer Engagement report, that there's a tension or a disconnect between nonprofits and funders. And many of us who helped fund and design that research, though I didn't implement it, I'll speak for myself, went in thinking we're going to learn that funders want fund, or that the disconnect is that funders aren't aware of how investing in volunteer engagement can really make a difference. And yet what we found was funders are open to it. Nonprofit leaders are not asking for it. So we can't just point to funders and say, gosh, you should be investing in volunteer engagement. Many funders were interested in that, but nonprofit leaders aren't asking for it. And that really falls, for better or worse, on us as leaders of volunteers, whether we're CEOs or volunteer coordinators or anything else in between. We need to be advocating to leadership to ask for funding. Third, we're at least in the US, in a cost of living crisis. And so with increased inflation, costs rising, that leads to additional barriers to engaging as volunteers: transportation costs, parking costs, economic constraints, and organizations can, with proper investment, mitigate some of those costs. And then finally, there's evolving priorities. Also, in this recent research by Points of Light that was released, we really brought to light in the volunteer engagement sphere how important belonging is to volunteers, and how feeling that they belong or could belong relates to increased engagement retention. But that doesn't happen without time. which is money, and without resources in terms of, again, technology, tools, and again, that's money. So for those four reasons, systemic reasons, funding, cost of living, and evolving priorities, I think there's no better time than now to talk about this.
That's fantastic. One of the things that you said that really speaks to me, because this is a passion of mine now as well, of like when I read the studies that, volunteers make a third of the nonprofit workforce, but they receive less than a 1/4% of all funding dollars go to anything with volunteer engagement. You know, I don't think I slept for like 2 nights. I'm like, what can we do to solve this problem? And that's why I'm so excited to talk about incremental investments in the space, because we want to talk about things like how do we remove friction? If someone wants to give their time, how do we get them to go from expressing that interest to showing up to that first shift with as few clicks as possible and as few phone calls or things in front of them as possible to remove those barriers and make it easy to volunteer our time. And then lastly, one of the things that you said where there's a big disconnect with the funders are open to investing in volunteer engagement and tools and resources, we need to make sure that we're doing a good job of making the ask. And so that's part of what this whole series is about is how do we do a good job at making the ask for these incremental investments? And we have a whole framework that we're going to go over, but yeah, that's why we're doing this is to prepare people and give them the tools to go make those asks and get funders to say no, rather than just not making the ask.
And Houston, I'm going to jump in and ask you to, spinning off of that, can you define what you mean or what we might both mean by incremental investments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've talked about this,
I
and
mean,
there's a few ways to look at it. But for me, specifically talking to organizations that have a dedicated role for a volunteer professional, so a volunteer coordinator, a volunteer manager. I come from running software companies. That's my background, not the volunteer world. And rule one in business is your most expensive line item in any business is headcount. And so I talked to a lot of volunteer coordinators, and they're like, we really don't have a budget. Like we're working on a $0 budget. But then I look at them and I say, well, you're a volunteer coordinator with a salary. So your organization is investing in you as a person and your salary to show they have some posture towards the further like betterment of volunteer engagement and how their volunteers work. So when we say incremental investment, I want us to look at these investment asks in the light of the total spend the organization is spending. So maybe you do truly have a $0 budget outside of your salary, but we're going to give some examples of how 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, $15,000 a year could make some really big changes to your organization. And that can sound like a very big, scary ask, especially if you haven't ever asked for it or received that before. But when you think about it in light of also having a salary on the books, the investment now becomes incremental, where it's like we're already in for X amount with a salary. Now we're asking for 10%, 5%, 10, 12% of that as an addition. That's going to see exponential results. And that's kind of what we're here talking about. And that leads us, like we practice this, Beth, it leads us great into our next question, which is one thing that I found talking with dozens of volunteer coordinators over the last, several weeks kind of about this thought is they get to a point where they're like, okay, yes, I want to make an incremental investment ask. I want to do the framework. What should I be asking for and what should I be expecting that I could show as a outcome for this investment? And so in your perspective and talking to so many great organizations, what are some often overlooked investments that people don't necessarily think of right off the top of their head when it comes to investing in volunteer strategies?
thank you. And I think having, real specifics is sometimes what's going to unlock people's confidence and comfort in asking for that. So I think a couple things come to mind. One is investing in infrastructure to support the strategy. So, what do we mean by infrastructure? I mean, we may have. It's interesting. I started in this field quite a while ago, and we didn't talk about volunteer engagement infrastructure with that term until about 10, 15 years ago. And yet we still have different understanding of it. So what does that mean? Staffing, as Houston mentioned, obviously having a professional staff. And that doesn't just mean headcount, but it also means investing in that staff through training, through accreditation. Actually, I was just on a call this morning unscripted, unplanned, without knowing we were connecting to this, but I can't help but think of it when it's a return training client. We're developing a training for her staff. And I said, as we're doing this, what's going to be the back and forth? Do we need to have a bunch of other people approve this as we're developing it, as we did when we worked together last year? And she said, no, I have my CVA now. And remarkably, now that I am a certified volunteer administrator, people see me with a lot more credibility, and they trust that I have the training and competence to do this. She'll bring people along, but we don't need to add time to that effort. So staffing means a lot more than just headcount. Technology is part of infrastructure. Obviously, we have the right people on this call hosting it to talk about the importance of technology. That can help with recruitment. It can help with impact stories. There's even, infrastructure is also space, and equipment. I often tell a story of when I was working with an organization, talking about incremental, small investments. I was working with a large marine mammal rescue and rehabilitation organization across the California coast, and we were doing a large scale assessment. We interviewed dozens and dozens of staff and volunteers. And when I asked the volunteers, what's one thing you would really like to see changed in order to make your work even more impactful? And we went in, we never know what we're going to expect, what we're going to get, but I certainly did not expect this answer. To a T, almost every volunteer who worked directly with the rescued marine mammals said, I want more brooms. And I'd be like, what? Brooms. They need brooms. It's a safety issue. More of them so they don't have to work so hard to find them to sweep the water that's out on the deck outside the pens where the marine mammals were being kept. And what a small investment that indicates a value in volunteers. So again, it could be 5,000, it could be 50,000. We could talk about $500,000 investment, but it also could be a couple $100 to just get brooms so volunteers are safe. All of that is part of infrastructure. Next, technology will help with this, but it has to come after some facilitated conversations. Defining who is a volunteer. We, I can't tell you how often I hear stories from people in the field realizing that they haven't counted their advocacy volunteers or the people who do fundraising for them as volunteers, which means they're not accurately and comprehensively talking about the impact that volunteers have. Oh, our volunteer services team handles our ambassador programs and our education programs and our clinical volunteers, but fundraising people, they're in a different area. But if we add the impacts of those individuals who step up to raise funds for causes they care about, if we add the money that they raised to our return on investment, we're telling a much more comprehensive story. So having facilitated conversations around who is a volunteer, I think makes a really big difference because that is a game changer with our storytelling and what we can ask for in terms of investment. And lastly, investing in your capacity. Yes, that could be with things like earning your certification in volunteer administration, but it also could be engaging a volunteer to help you and free you up to do other work for which you're uniquely qualified. Engaging volunteers to help with data entry, uh, really, and your could be a plural your, not just you individually. It could be your organization's capacity. Pilot a program where you engage capacity building volunteers and tell that story widely of your success, presumably, or what you learned and how you can tweak it and scale it in the future. And sometimes that takes money, and sometimes it just takes time and maybe coaching. But when you do that, again, you will make a better case to make incremental future investments in volunteer engagement. Houston,
Yeah,
feel
that's
free
so.
to add on any others. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that I think I want to pause on for a second because a lot of times, and it is true, most of the investments we're talking about in this are financial investments. But I always tell people that I'm working with, like, we want to invest as much of our time, talent, and treasure into the volunteer program as possible. And one key word that I think on the first bullet point that I'm sure can hone in on, Beth, and you spend a lot of time with, is invest in infrastructure to support the strategy. A lot of times, people want to invest in the infrastructure, but they don't actually have clearly an articulate strategy to build the infrastructure around. And so sometimes maybe the first step in an incremental investment may be day off in a nice park when it's sunny and a whiteboard or a notepad and mapping out what your strategy is. Like I always ask people, like, imagine we're high-fiving 1 year from now and you've accomplished everything that you've set out to accomplish. What does your program look like? What's
Yeah.
different then than it is now? And a lot of people have it in their like they know that, but they haven't taken the time to articulate and write that down and make a plan. And there are so many studies out there that talk about like just even taking that step of writing it down increases the chances for you to accomplish that drastically. For a lot of people, they want to do something and make a move, but they're buying infrastructure without the strategy clearly in a plain plan. And so then the infrastructure sometimes gets in the way or stumbles around because we don't have that strategy like clearly thought out and shared. And I always say happiness in an organization is the realization of shared expectations. And so if they're not shared with the executive directors, the board, whoever, then you can't have those realizations come to fruition for the shared expectations. And I think that is a key part as well to this starting point of these incremental investments.
Well, Houston, you're speaking my language, and that I mean I love that you keyed into strategy, and I'm thrilled that it came up and sort of can't believe I hadn't already thought about bringing it into this conversation. But that is the importance of language. Um, that you will hear, you who are on this call will hear that we are mostly talking about volunteer engagement as a strategy, not as a program. And and so the first investment is for you to continue on wherever you are in your journey of really embracing a shift from simply managing volunteers to truly engaging them, from creating a program to instead leading a strategy of volunteer engagement that keys into your organizational priorities. So this isn't a conversation about strategic planning for volunteer engagement, though I love that topic and love to talk about it and think your point, Houston, was incredibly important that every leader of volunteers should either have a strategic plan for volunteer engagement or even better, have a clear articulation of how engaging volunteers advances the organization's strategic plan. So if you don't know where to start on that sunny day with a whiteboard like Houston described, start with your organization's strategic plan and answer the question for each of the pillars. How can engaging volunteers help us advance this goal about financial stability? How can engaging volunteers help us achieve this goal around better service to our clients. This goal for growth, because only by tying our work, the strategy of engaging volunteers into the organizational strategic priorities, can you even begin to make the case, should you even begin to make the case for investing in it?
Yeah, totally on the same page. And I think, that's what we want to do is be very, no matter where you're at, where you're starting, to give you ideas, whether it's you're prepping to make a 50,000, $100,000 ask to, I want to get up to be able to buy some brooms for my volunteers. And that's real, and that increases their experience. And one of the things that we're really honing in on is the importance of the volunteer experience. When volunteers have a better experience, they show up differently, they become advocates, they become more of a outspoken strategic part of your organization. And it all leads to one another. And so kind of on that, we're kind of already talking about this. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but I know we're both so excited and passionate about this. We want to poke and prod and give people ideas that they can take even just from this singular webinar to begin making a case. And we have a framework for making a case. We kind of reviewed it in the first webinar. We'll continue those in the following webinars. But what are some small changes that you've seen that create actual visible wins? Because I know we were speaking earlier, one of the cool things about incremental investments is maybe you have this $50,000 ask you really want to make. But if you could make the ask for the brooms to start and say, this is what you're going to see when I get this $250 for brooms, Then you buy the brooms, you go get the win, you report it back to your organization, then you make $1,000 ask. You kind of like buy credibility with your organization that you're a good steward of this investment. And when they invest in your program, they get the expected return. So I would love to hear some stories about what you've seen and how that is building momentum internally in organizations.
Yeah, so the first thing again, here we are with our friends at Better Impact. So the first thing that came to mind obviously was technology. And technology can mean a lot of different things, right? But let's start with the case making. The strong technology will now allow you through impact dashboards to be able to really tell um, tell a more robust story about not just how many volunteers and how many hours they contributed, but also how many students they mentored, how many adult literacy adult students they've tutored, how many trees were planted, what difference this is making for children in terms of being on grade level for school, etc. Impact dashboards and tying those impacts into research that's already being done by your organization on client outcomes is really, really key. And again, this takes time and some money, not an enormous amount, but it also could simply be your time in training and better understanding how to leverage technology that you have. So technology is huge. Another piece of technology is integrations. Um, how are you tying your tech and volunteer management software into um, uh, donor management software so you can tell powerful stories about how many volunteers are donors and how many donors become volunteers, et cetera. We can automate workflows so that you and your colleagues are freed up to do the work for which they are uniquely qualified. So communications with volunteers. This also may fit into AI. How can we leverage AI to help us appropriately so that we can focus more on the relational stuff and get the administrative stuff being automated? So technology is a big bucket that really I should have let Houston talk about, but we'll let him add on to it. Um, Another piece is what do you know about volunteers? And so this is kind of tech related, but I also think it gets beyond that. What do we know about the skills that your volunteers have and are willing to offer? How many times has a volunteer shown up to, for a day of service? And this is a real story. I won't use any names, shown up and they were a little late. So the woman in charge of the service day sent them to clean out some potted plants outside and brought them some lemonade and found out it was the CFO of the company that was sharing their time, and she had had them weeding outside and quickly brought this team inside to talk with their finance team, right? What do we know about the skills that volunteers have to offer, and how can we use that information to tap for new emerging needs? That helps us with cultivation. And it may also help with training, but I think the other reason we threw training under the concept of skills is that investing in training of volunteers is something that volunteers actually want. Many volunteers are seeking to gain skills and enhance skills. So investing in that can really have huge repercussions, ripple effects. I think of a story of my office is just a couple blocks from a large metropolitan human service agency, and a gentleman I interviewed a couple years back had just retired and moved to this town and heard about their Lunchbox Express program, which is a summer school bus that they retrofitted during the summer to deliver lunches to neighborhoods. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, in the Denver area that have a high percentage during the school year of students who receive free or reduced cost lunches. So during the summer, they may not have access to lunches. So they deliver these lunches on the bus, and he showed up here retired to be near his children and grandchildren, and he wanted to get on that bus and deliver lunches. But during the onboarding conversation, Nancy, the volunteer director, said, by the way, what did you do? What did you just retire from? And he was a retired civilian Department of Defense employee who'd worked in HR all around the world, who obviously had skills in compliance. And she said, "Oh, how would you like to help our HR?" department. And he said, great, but not during the summer because I want to drive the bus during the summer. She said, got it. Happy to do that. Right. So that's an investment in her time. And I see Amber's comment. It's absolutely true. Many volunteers do not want to use skills from their professional careers, but we won't know unless we ask them. So I agree completely. Many people want to use their avocational skills or gain new skills to enhance, to enrich their life in other ways. So thank you for bringing that up. The last piece I'll share is, of course, the volunteer experience. What can we invest in small ways that creates visible wins? We need to understand the research, and we'll be sharing more of that shortly about what volunteers today want. We can share it from a national and global perspective, but you can also do research with your own volunteers or your own not yet volunteers, your prospective volunteers. What did they want? So that you can then really focus on volunteer experience. What does that mean? It means ensuring that you're investing in good, strong orientations, in easy onboarding, in the, survival things they need to be out for a day, cleaning up neighborhood alleys, whether that's water and snacks or swag, whatever that is. Um, it's also about investing in people, paid or unpaid, create that sense of community. There's a classic study. Yeah, it was in the links I shared. Hopefully, we'll be able to paste it again, called the Leadership Ladder. It's back from 2009. I still think it was a landmark study by New York Cares and other researchers that identified that having project leads, volunteer peer leaders, isn't enough unless you actually train them, that part of success is they're nurturing a sense of community among volunteers and wanting and encouraging volunteers to come back. Many of their team leads just went in thinking, my job is to get this project done, so I'm going to make sure I get all the volunteers today to do that. But once they realized that team leads were inadvertently undermining return engagement, they changed their position description, trained them, gave them tools and assets, easy emails to customize to nurture that connection. And lastly, and I won't get into this too much, though I do love the topic, I think we need to think about uh, how we are building powerful moments. There is a link that I just shared with Court. She'll repost it. From a study, it's a number of years ago, but a study called Volunteer Stages and Transitions. This was an academic study, but it talked about the importance of powerful moments for volunteers in order for them to move from being a newbie or a novice to being fully engaged. What are the powerful moments in your organization? Is it the chance to be mentored and meet with a staff member? Is it receiving their certification in CPR so that they can be deployed as a disaster volunteer? Uh, is it a chance to understand the difference they made for the student? We are human, and all that we can talk about technology and skills banks, but this is about being human and creating and choreographing moments, not just you, but your colleagues, volunteer leaders that can choreograph moments that are going to help people feel connected and impactful.
I love that. I think that covers like a wide array of different areas that we can make investments and improve it. And one thing I will say, coming from a software tech background and that angle from how we can help do this, our plumb line at Better Impact is we want to help you unlock the volunteer experience. And so one thing that I always like to say, and I've done a couple speaking engagements on, is helping people unlock their superpower. I love meeting volunteer coordinators and volunteer professionals and getting to talk to clients. It's literally like what gets me up in the morning. It's just such a fun thing. And what I hate to see are these great people who have such a heart for their community and the volunteers and want to dive in, like the comment that came up about like, well, not everyone wants to use their vocational skills. Some really do, and they get more excited, but it requires that conversation, getting
Mhm.
to know your volunteers, making them feel seen, giving them a place of belonging. And so many times I talk to volunteer coordinators, and it's like they want to be focused on that, but they're focused on inputting things in spreadsheets, and they're focused on setting up manual emails, and they're focused on all of these reporting things that's not in their wheelhouse, it's not their superpower. So our goal, whether it's from a consulting standpoint, a technology standpoint, or this webinar as a whole, is to come alongside the great people who are working in this field and say, how can we be your partner to get you in your superpower, doing the thing that you're uniquely gifted at, the things that get you up in the morning, that bring you energy. It's a joy to go to work when you get to focus on these two things only, and you don't have to focus on these eight. One of the things we always talk about in workshops like this is what can you delegate, what can you eliminate, what can you elevate. So like what are things that you're doing that you could delegate to a volunteer, like a skills-based volunteer or somebody that would be able to open up some capacity, or delegate to technology? What can you automate through the use of technology and these integrations? And what are some things that you're doing that maybe you could just truly question, and maybe you could just eliminate them because they're just the juices that worth the squeeze. They're taking a lot of your time and energy, but they're not producing those results that you're tracking and you want to get to. And so I'm so excited to continue this conversation because that is what I want for all of our clients, non-clients alike, obviously, just anyone in the field, is how do we position you to be in a place where you can be in your superpower, your one thing. Different business books call it different things. It's the same concept. It's like the thing that you do better than anyone else that brings you energy. And a lot of that is what's going to increase that volunteer experience. So we want to be careful when we're making these investments that we're not like trying to automate ourselves out of a job, right? Like the person to person connection is so important. It's just what are we wasting time on that we could have robots do for us, whether it's AI or email automations or integrations or consultations or frameworks, et cetera. Um, I'm really excited. We just released a fairly large study where we tracked and watched over 2.5 million volunteers every day, over tens of thousands of organizations. And we saw that over our client base, there was a net growth of about 5% overall from about 2.3 to 2.5 million volunteers over the last 12 months. We just launched that at National Volunteer Week. One of the hot topics that have really come to mind when I talk to a lot of these organizations is recruitment. Seems like a lot of people are focused on recruitment, recruitment, recruitment. And I know I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts as well about like recruitment as one piece of the puzzle, then it's onboarding and retention and engagement and referrals. But what do you think is happening here? Like, do we feel like this is still like trying to recover from the pre-COVID numbers and recruitment as a hot topic? Is it generational recruitment and there's gaps that we're seeing? Like from your perspective, Beth, why are we so focused on recruitment, and what are the trends that you're seeing, kind of alongside the study that we found looking at these 2.5 million volunteers over the last year?
Well, we definitely see that, recruitment in the minds of leaders of volunteers, recruitment is a named challenge. And yet, so often it's not a failing in recruitment. Um, and then I'm not disagreeing with that perception, but that it relates to other issues, as you kind of indicated, Houston, that often it's a retention problem, right? It's often symptoms of um, of problematic retention. I also will say, and I'll explicate that a little more in a moment, but I think that that recruitment, we also need to define what recruitment and retention success are. And about 10 years ago or so, we were hired by an organization to do some retention research. And among the research that we did was an academic literature review. And we found that there is no industry standard definition of retention, which might feel like, oh God, that leaves us hanging. And I, always being the positive spin, think that's incredibly empowering. We get to define for our organizations what is retention success, and the same thing with recruitment success. Ultimately, recruitment success, I understand, is about getting, you know, slots filled, butts in seats, so to speak. But there's lots of other aspects of recruitment that could be measured and also tracked, like exposure through our website, right? Website views, orientation, attendance. What else are they learning about the organization? Are they choosing not to volunteer because it doesn't fit their schedules, but they are making a donation? So I think we need to really define what is recruitment success before we deem it as a failure or as a challenge. But I also think we need to look at larger data that's not just about numbers. And again, looking at this report from the Points of Light recently released National Strategy Progress Report, to me, one of the most powerful and compelling data points, or two of them, are here on the screen. 44% of volunteers interviewed or surveyed stated that they did not sign up to volunteer due to uncertainty about belonging. And even more concerning to me, 40 or just as concerning, 43% stated that they stopped volunteering when they did not feel that they belonged. And that kind of goes back to that leadership ladder study that I mentioned from New York Cares from 2009, when the volunteer team leaders indicated were recognized that their success was also getting volunteers to come back. They changed their whole demeanor. They changed the whole way that they engaged with volunteers and made sure that they knew their names and made sure that they felt like they belonged. And volunteers not only stayed more, but they moved up the leadership ladder. So, in terms of recruitment and retention, I think it's really important to think about what are we signaling about whether prospective volunteers will belong here in our recruitment efforts. And once they show up, do they truly feel they are recognized and belonged? I started my career, many people have heard me say this, I started my career working in museums for 15 years before I moved into the consulting arena. And one of the things that I often talk about was the amazing system that the museum where I worked, which had about 2,300 active volunteers, it was a large strategy, um, was having shift captains and peer leadership. And I think that is incredibly powerful. And yet, in the mid 20 teens, after I had left, they did some studies and found that when they acknowledged and recognized that a disproportionate number of volunteers of color were leaving and not staying, as opposed to volunteers who identified as white. And they did exit interviews and found that this system of team leads and shift captains was undermining volunteers' sense of belonging, and they dismantled that system, and they are still doing great in terms of their engagement. So, what data do you have about not just data, but stories and understanding about the messages that you're sending out and what people are actually experiencing, what they get once they get there? Because that will really support and shift your ability to create that relational side of engagement.
Yeah, totally checks. I'll be brief because I know we have 20 minutes left and a
Yeah.
lot more questions to get through. But on the topic of recruitment specifically, I know one thing when I talk to people a lot, if recruitment seems to be the bottleneck and the big problem in an organization, that means it's like all hands on deck. We want to do something. And a lot of times people, um, like no ill intent, confuse busyness for productivity. So like
Mhm.
if I'm busy at a thing, I'm making moves towards it, it's going to get better. But what we really want to do is be able to track, well, of your efforts to recruit, where are people that are coming and turning into the volunteers that you want, whether it's retaining them for a long time, or sometimes the volunteer roles are for shorter stints where retention isn't as key. Where are they coming from? I talked to one client and she mentioned that every Saturday she would lug a big tent up to the farmers market for recruitment. It was such a pain and it was like several hours of her day. And when we dove in the numbers, we found out that like over 90% of her recruitment we could attribute to social media and website presence. We're like, hey, could you save 6 hours a week to do something else and not lug the tent to the farmer's market and have like almost no effect to your recruitment pipeline? Like the answer is yes. So let's take those 6 hours and buy them back on something that's productive, not just busy. And a lot of times when we get overwhelmed with facing a problem and we don't know exactly what the right next step is, we just choose to stay busy because it feels like we're being productive. And so that's why it's important to you to get that whiteboard and take a step back and look at the data to see, can you attribute where your volunteers are finding you, whether it's referrals from your culture, online campaign, maybe it is a farmer's market if you have a certain demographic or a college, et cetera. All right, we've talked a lot about this. talk a lot on steps two, three, and four of like you've already made one investment. Here's how you make more. And typically, what I find is it's easier to make the second ask and the third ask than the first ask. The first ask is often the hardest.
Yep.
But how do people even know where to begin when thinking about investing in infrastructure? Like maybe they're truly like outside of my salary, I have a $0 budget. The first thing I would say is like reframe that of like you have a big budget for volunteers, but it's your salary. Like so it's incremental. But what's a good first step? How do we know where to begin if someone's listening that just doesn't have has never made an ask and has like a virtually no budget for things?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with just auditing what's currently there. What do you have and where are there gaps, right? What infrastructure is there from brooms to to much larger investments, brooms to buildings, whatever. What infrastructure do you have? And pair that with an audit of your current engagement. Where do you have strengths that you can build on? What assets do you already have? And then again, where are there gaps? And looking at those two things can surface what we like to call at BQ Volunteer Strategies your critical intervention points. What is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck? And so, sure, you might imagine, well, boy, if we had a team of three new dedicated volunteer coordinators, we could do XYZ. But what actually is going to maybe more realistically, and more power to you if you think you can ask for that, but what are the current priorities of your organization? What is already on the books that volunteers can help you advance? And what resources do you need to actually leverage the volunteer resource towards that end. So maybe you're planning on expanding, your organization is expanding its footprint. How can volunteers help with that? What resources do you need that's going to help move that forward? Maybe you have a new building opening. Maybe you just have a new program that's being piloted. What are the ways that you can tap into volunteers that are going to advance something that is already a priority that people are bought into? I think that's one of the most important things because that's going to give your ask some teeth and give your case making some more teeth. Go ahead, Houston. You look like you have something to add.
Oh no, I would no, you keep going on this until
Oh,
you go get us through.
yeah, I mean, and I think it doesn't have to be a big ask. I'm going to talk in a little bit potentially about the importance of piloting. You can say, look, the organization is considering doing XYZ. I'd like to get us ready and test some ideas. Let's pilot this and we can engage some volunteers to help us in this area and we'll sort of move forward from there. Or again, even if it isn't a strategic priority, look at your strategic needs. I think about a humane society we worked with years ago in New Hampshire, Monadnock Humane Society. They had, speaking of technology, seven or so different tech systems, shelter operations, veterinary medicine, technology systems, volunteer management software, donor software. Did I already say this? Kennel operations software. And they needed to figure out where they were going to invest next. They found a volunteer, two of them, with tech savvy experience who interviewed staff, assessed these different tech systems, and then made a report and a recommendation around where they should invest next. It was a time limited, incredibly impactful project that was through a pilot initiative, engaging skills-based volunteers. And they then also helped make the case to invest in improvements technologically, not all at once, but over a serial period, a time, a sequence that made sense.
So let's hop right into the next one. Like let's get to the nitty gritty. Like I'm sure over the years you have so many examples, but could you give us a couple examples, like real examples? You also name the names, but like real examples of organizations that made a modest investment and saw a like disproportionate level of returns.
So one I'm working with right now, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, national health organization dedicated to raising awareness, finding solutions, and serving families who are affected by this early onset dementia. Um, and we work with them last year on a large scale assessment. One of the needs that was identified was staff training. it was great to have a full scale assessment. We surfaced a lot of needs that fed into their strategic plan overall, but you may not even need a full scale assessment to know that you need staff training. AFTD came back to us and said, okay, now we're ready to implement staff training. And they invested in us to help them develop and train their staff to deliver these trainings ongoingly. And I'm doing my first one next Monday. So staff training is key. And in the grand scheme, we feel well paid, but it's not a big expense. So staff training is one. Building capacity. Gosh, I mean, I'll just go back to the Monadnock Humane Society. They engaged. It took some time for coaching on how to engage skills-based volunteers, but ultimately they learned how to do it and engaged those volunteers who were not their traditional volunteers. These were not individuals who were attracted to come and cuddle kittens and pet puppies. They wanted to bring their tech knowledge to help over a 4-month period assess needs, wrote a report, made recommendations, and the investment was in coaching in how to leverage volunteers. You could pay for accreditations. I already mentioned the CVA, the Certified Volunteer Administration credential, which has a fee involved, but as per my client this morning, it's already giving her credibility to move forward. You could do an organizational accreditation like the Service Enterprise Accreditation. We recently accredited Habitat of Metro Denver. We reaccredited them. Not a big investment of money, but some time. And this is not about even getting their accreditation. This is the second time they've renewed because they feel that every 3 years, checking how they're doing and filling out this action plan and benchmarking against national standards really, really helps them. And then lastly, you could work with a funder, like we worked for many years with UJA Federation of New York, who invested for them a relatively small amount in helping organizations pilot volunteer engagement initiatives. And they gave them, after these organizations, and we did they were called volunteer accelerators. We did one with food pantries in 2019, 2020. We then moved on to organizations who worked in workforce development. Then we did emergency mental health and emergency organizations, critical services, crisis services, that was the word. But in any case, we did these cohorts, and once they demonstrated through a small investment that they really understood and could leverage a volunteer engagement strategy, UJ was willing to invest more heavily in staffing expansion for these organizations. So talk to funders about what would it take to provide us some coaching and support so we could prove to you that we're worthy of even larger investments. So those are just 4 examples, 4 or 5, to hopefully get your ideas flowing.
Awesome. So I think we've talked about a lot of ideas. We've talked about like one of the problems I always say at Better Impact, the biggest problem we have is we have too many opportunities to say yes to. Like we want to help in so many ways. And so sometimes it's about prioritizing those and rank and rating and saying what's the next best. And there's a lot of ways to do that, whether it's looking at what's urgent and not important versus urgent and important. There's so many charts. What have you seen successful when you are helping people think through how to identify the next best, maybe not the next most obvious, but the next best investment
Yep.
opportunity?
I think, I already talked a little bit about critical intervention points. I think it's about assessing your needs, identifying these opportunities, and figuring out which opportunities you can hang on the scaffolding of other priorities of your organization. People are not going to get on board to support or invest in something that isn't already part of what may feel like, an overwhelming list of priorities. So how can you demonstrate that investing in volunteer engagement is going to advance existing priorities? And it's great to pilot it, get those results, and scale it up. Seeing Carolina's comment. Hey, Carolina, I just talked to you this week. She's in our current service enterprise cohort across the state of Florida. It makes me think that another piece that we didn't even add to the slide is you could also assess your needs, as I talked about. Go through the service enterprise diagnostic, even if you don't go for the full training and accreditation. Do another assessment so that you can also identify your next best investment opportunity by seeing where your organization has gaps that could really become tipping points for more efficiency as you grow, whether it's investing in recruitment or retention or staffing or things like that. So that's another way to slice that pie.
Awesome. One thing that I'll say about that as well is, one of our internal lines we always say is we want to do things the best they can be done, not the best we can do them alone. And so I think it's so big. Like I love connecting other coordinators with other coordinators. Like sometimes you get in the weeds and in the whirlwind and feel like you're on an island. And so sometimes one of the ways that you can really think through how do I find the next best opportunity is what's working for other people in similar situations. I know at Better Impact, this is why I think Karen is in the chat, but she leads our user groups. And we have almost 2,000 volunteer coordinators that meet on some type of regular cadence just to get together and talk best practices. Hey, here's where I'm strong and where I'm struggling, and vice versa, and make those connections. And so it's like, let's not reinvent the wheel, whether it's through a technology partner or a consultant or just a peer in your network that is can empathize with what you're going through and has had some successes in areas where you're weak. Like, let's get together and like open the conversation and be super proud to share our wins. I know, sometimes that's hard is to share your wins and feel like, well, I'm sharing my wins. I feel like I'm bragging. It's like, no, it's encouraging. Like, hey, I had no budget. I got a budget, and here's how. Like, there are 50 people in line wanting
Yeah.
to hear that story to use that. And so I just want to encourage, we have such a great community and so many people are doing great things. And I want you to like that space to celebrate your wins and where you feel like you're really strong, because that's going to help encourage others and then give you the ability to ask, for help as well. So on that, how do we advocate for these incremental investments to our executive directors, to the board, or whoever is the appropriate person?
Activating conversations to unleash the power of strategic volunteer engagement is a toolkit that was written by Dr. Sue Carter-Kale and others after our research for the State of Volunteer Engagement report in 2022. It's specifically designed to help you make the case to funders or to leadership. And plus an older one that's still really valuable by the Leedy Foundation, partnering with funders to unleash the power of volunteers. So I'm going to talk big picture, but you have some like tools and templates coming in the links. So I think it's important, as you see on the screen here, to start with your core message. What are you asking for, and why? And then that's really 1 to 2 sentences. If you can't boil this down to what is going to be different as a result of this investment, then you have some work to do before you make the ask. Create some supportive message points. And then a big piece in influencing is anticipating what pushback or questions you might receive and trying to nip those in the bud, right? Anticipate questions, but also view this not just as a presentation, but as a conversation. How can you facilitate this and be prepared for things you may not expect? And be honest about that. But I think preparing a good case is about clarifying your message, being prepared with support points, anticipating pushback and questions, realizing you're not going to get a yay or nay. What you want is, I mean, it's just brain science. You want people to noodle over this, have a conversation about it, because that makes them more invested. And then be persevere, be perseverant, whatever the word is. Keep following up, keep going, and know that if the answer isn't is a not now, go back again because maybe it'll be in the future.